By the time Catherine Donohue could no longer hold the brush, her own jawbone was sitting on her bedside table in a small glass jar. The bone had come out of her mouth in pieces. Some pieces she pulled out herself, with her fingers, between sips of water. Some pieces her dentist removed in the small examining room above the drugstore on Madison Street in Ottawa, Illinois. One piece, the largest, almost 2 inches long, came out the night her son Tommy turned 8, while she was singing to him from her bed. She kept that piece in the jar, on the table, beside her wedding photograph. She wanted her children to see it. She wanted them to know what the company had done. In the dark of her bedroom that summer of 1938, the jar glowed. Faintly. A pale, milky greenish light, the color of moonlight on shallow water. It had been glowing for 15 years. It would still be glowing 70 years after Catherine was buried, when university researchers in 2008 placed Geiger counters above her grave at St. Columba Cemetery and watched the needles climb. Her bones are still radioactive today. The bones of every dial painter who ever swallowed radium are still radioactive today. They will be radioactive for another 1,600 years. This is the story of the young American women who painted the watches that glowed in the dark, and of the company that knew and lied and watched them die. This is the story of Catherine Wolfe Donohue, who weighed 71 pounds when she gave her final court testimony from a wicker chair on her own front porch. This is the story of Grace Fryer, who at 22 could not turn her head without dislocating her own neck. This is the story of 15 American women who, between them, swallowed enough radium to fight cancer in 1,000 patients today. Only no one was treating cancer. They were painting the timepieces a country wore on its wrist. In 1917, a young chemist named Sabin Arnold von Soschaki perfected a new kind of paint. He mixed radium-226, the brightest, most expensive radioactive element on Earth, $200,000 per gram, with zinc sulfide and a little adhesive binder. He called the paint Undark. Brushed onto the face of a watch, Undark glowed for years. Brushed onto the dial of an aircraft instrument, it let pilots fly through clouds. Brushed onto the front sight of a rifle, it let an American doughboy in a French trench at midnight see what he was aiming at. The United States War Department bought every gram von Soschaki could produce. Von Soschaki founded the Radium Luminous Materials Corporation in Newark, New Jersey, and within 2 years he had a factory in Orange, New Jersey, employing 300 women, and contracts with the Army, the Navy, Westclox, Ingersoll, Bulova, Elgin, and the Waltham Watch Company. By 1920, his company was renamed the United States Radium Corporation. By 1922, 2 more dial painting plants had opened, modeled on his. Waterbury Clock in Connecticut and the Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois. Together, between 1917 and 1926, those 3 factories employed roughly 4,000 American women. Nearly all were between 14 and 25 years old. Most were the daughters of Irish, Italian, Polish, and Slovak immigrants. They lived at home with their mothers. They went to Mass on Sunday. They were saving to get married. The work paid extraordinarily well. A skilled dial painter could finish 250 watch faces in a single shift, at a piecework rate of 1.5 cents per dial. The fastest girls earned $20 a week in $22. A school teacher made $12. A garment worker made $8. A coal miner's wife in Pennsylvania did not see $20 in a month. Mothers walked their 14-year-old daughters to the gates of the Orange plant and the Ottawa plant and asked the foreman to hire them, please. Brides-to-be worked there until the wedding day, then quit and used their savings to furnish a house. The company gave the painters 2-week paid vacations and Christmas bonuses. The company photographed them in matching white smocks for advertisements. The company called them, in its own promotional material, the cleanest, healthiest, and most cheerful workers in American industry. Inside the studio rooms, long wooden tables, 100 women per row, a single bare light bulb above each table. The foreman taught every new girl the technique. The brushes were tiny. Camel hair, 3 or 4 hairs only. After a few strokes, the bristles spread and frayed, and the painted line on the watch face turned thick and ugly. The company demanded thin lines. The foreman taught the girls to put the brush in the mouth, between the lips, and twist, drawing the wet bristles to a fine point with their tongues. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. 3 to 6 times every minute. 200 to 400 times per hour. 8 hours a day. 5.5 days a week. One girl in orange, May Cubberly, the foreman who first taught the technique to Grace Fryer, would later testify that she had asked her supervisor in 1917 whether the paint was safe. The supervisor, a man named Mr. Savoy, laughed and said the paint would put roses in her cheeks. Lip, dip, paint. Some of the girls swallowed the brush bristles. Some swallowed flecks of dried paint. Most swallowed a thin film of radium powder mixed with their own saliva, every 4 to 10 seconds, all day long. A 1928 Public Health Service estimate later calculated that the average dial painter ingested between 1 and 2 micrograms of radium-226 per working day. Over the course of 3 years on the job, the typical career length before marriage, that figure climbed to roughly 1,500 micrograms total, lodged permanently in the painter's bones. The lethal dose for the same body weight is approximately 500 micrograms. Most of the girls absorbed 3 times the lethal dose before their 21st birthday. Radium-226 has a half-life of 1,600 years. When it enters the human body, the body cannot tell it apart from calcium. Calcium is the building block of bone. Calcium is what makes a young woman's jaw, her ribs, her spine, her femurs, her teeth. The body absorbed the radium and laid it down inside the bone atom by atom, where it would stay for the rest of the woman's life, and for 1,600 years after she was buried. Inside the bone, each radium atom decayed, and as it decayed, it fired alpha particles into the surrounding marrow, into the surrounding tissue, into the cells that made new blood. Alpha particles in the open air travel only an inch or two and can be stopped by a sheet of paper. Alpha particles fired from inside a bone into living tissue at point-blank range are among the most destructive forces a human body can encounter. They burned holes in the painter's jaws. They turned their hip bones to chalk. They blackened their teeth. They gave them bone cancers, blood cancers, anemias for which there was no name in 1925. But the company knew none of this. Or rather, the company did not yet know all of this. The girls knew none of it. The girls thought the paint put roses in their cheeks. In Orange, New Jersey, the painters left the studio at 6 in the evening and walked home through Main Street still glowing. Their hair glowed, their fingernails glowed. Their teeth glowed when they smiled, faintly, in the dim light of the street lamps. They thought it was beautiful. They called themselves the Ghost Girls. On Saturday nights, before going to dance halls, they used the leftover radium paint on their nails as polish, on their lips as gloss, and on their best dresses for sparkle. One girl in the orange plant, Mollie Maggia, painted her teeth with radium so they would glow when she kissed her boyfriend in the dark. Mollie Maggia would be the first dial painter to die. She was 24 years old. In Ottawa, Illinois, 300 miles from any radium expert, surrounded by the cornfields of LaSalle County, a young woman named Catherine Wolfe walked into the Radium Dial Company on a Monday morning in February 1922. She was 19. She was the daughter of Irish immigrants who had worked the streetcars and the ribbon factories of Chicago and saved every penny to move their family to a small frame house on East Superior Street. Catherine had finished the 8th grade at St. Columba School, where the nuns had taught her to read and to keep books. She was small, 5 feet 2 inches tall, 98 pounds, dark hair, blue eyes, freckles across her nose. The foreman gave her a brush, a tray of 50 watch dials, and a small lead-lined cup of glowing paint. Catherine sat down at the long wooden table in the studio. She put the brush between her lips. She drew the bristles to a point. She dipped. She painted. By 6 o'clock that evening, she had painted 110 dials and earned $1.65. She thought it was the best job she had ever had. 500 miles east, in the Orange, New Jersey plant, on the same morning, a young Newark woman named Grace Fryer was finishing her third year at the dial painting table. Grace was 20. She was the daughter of a German-American carpenter, blonde, tall for a woman of her time at 5 feet 7 inches, ambitious. She had taken the job at U.S. Radium in 1917 specifically because the work paid more than any other job available to a young woman in northern New Jersey, and because Grace was saving to leave home and become a bank teller, perhaps eventually even a bank manager. She lived at home with her parents on Hawthorne Avenue. She had a sweetheart, an officer in the U.S. Army Air Service named Lieutenant Charles Sawyer, whom she had met at a church social. She was 20 years old, beautiful, healthy, ambitious, in love. She would be dead by 33. Grace Fryer, 1917 to 1928, Orange, New Jersey. Inside both factories, in Orange, in Ottawa, and in Waterbury, Connecticut, where a third group of dial painters worked the same hours under the same foreman with the same camel hair brushes, the company doctors administered annual physicals. Every year. The girls were x-rayed, weighed, examined, and told they were perfectly healthy. Some of them were given small vials of a radium tonic called Radiator, sold by another company, but enthusiastically endorsed by the U.S. Radium Corporation as a health drink, and told that radium would in fact improve their bone density and their general vigor. The vials cost $1 each. The girls drank them gratefully. Inside the company's executive offices in Newark, however, the management did know. They had known, in fact, since 1917, the founding year. Sabin von Sohaki himself, the inventor of Undark, had handled liquid radium with his bare hands during the formulation phase. And by 1922, his fingertips were turning black, his fingernails were falling off, and his physician, a New York radiologist named Dr. Frederick Flynn, was telling him privately that he had, in clinical terms, poisoned himself beyond any hope of recovery. Von Sohaki lived another 6 years in increasing pain. He died in 1928 of aplastic anemia caused by radium exposure at the age of 45. He died knowing exactly what was happening to the 4,000 young women in his factories. He never told them. In December 1921, the company hired a new president named Arthur Roeder, a Wall Street businessman, no scientific training, brought in to maximize the company's contracts and dividends. Roeder was 37. He had a wife and 2 daughters in a large house in Montclair. Within his first month on the job, the company's chief chemist, a man named Howard Barker, briefed him in writing on the toxicology of ingested radium. Barker's memo, dated January 1922, survived in the legal discovery process and would be entered into evidence in 1928. The memo stated, in plain English, that swallowed radium accumulated in human bones could not be removed and would cause severe and likely fatal medical effects over time. Roeder filed the memo. He did not warn the painters. He did not change the technique. He did not provide protective equipment. The lip-dip paint method continued unchanged for another 5 years. Mollie Maggia, the girl who had painted her teeth to glow in the dark, started having a toothache in October of 1921. Her dentist in Orange, Dr. Joseph Neff, pulled the offending tooth on a Tuesday morning. The next week, the tooth beside the empty socket also began to ache. Dr. Neff pulled that one too. By December, 3 more teeth had come out. By January 1922, the empty sockets in Mollie's lower jaw were not healing. They were ulcerating. The bone underneath was turning gray. In May 1922, Dr. Neff reached into Mollie's mouth with his fingers, took hold of her lower jaw and lifted out, without using any instrument, without any cutting, a piece of bone the size of a child's fist. Most of her lower mandible came out in his hand. He was a dentist of 19 years. He had never seen anything like it. Mollie Maggia died on the 12th of September 1922 at the age of 24. The official cause of death listed on her certificate, signed by a different physician, was syphilis. She was buried in St. Mary's Cemetery in Orange, New Jersey. Her family mourned in shame for 5 years. Mollie Maggia had never been married. She had never had a sweetheart. She had been an Italian-American girl from a Catholic family, a girl who took communion every Sunday. A girl who had painted her teeth with glowing paint to look pretty for one boy at the local dance hall. Mollie Maggia had not died of syphilis. Mollie Maggia had died of radium poisoning. The diagnosis on her death certificate had been suggested to her physician by a U.S. Radium Corporation consulting doctor named Dr. Cecil Drinker, under what circumstances would later become a national scandal. Mollie Maggia, September 12, 1922, first dial painter to die. Dr. Kneff, the dentist, was alarmed. He began comparing notes with the other dentists in Orange and Newark. Within months, he found 7 young women, all former U.S. Radium Dial painters, all with the same destruction of the lower jaw. 3 of them had already died. Dr. Kneff wrote to the U.S. Radium Corporation in 1923 and asked plainly whether the radium paint might be the cause. The company's reply, signed by Arthur Roeder personally, stated that the company had never had any indication of any health problem associated with its product, that the paint was harmless when used as directed, and that the doctor's concerns were not consistent with the medical literature. The reply was a lie. Howard Barker's January 1922 memo was sitting in Roeder's filing cabinet on the day he wrote it. By 1924, the death toll among Orange, New Jersey dial painters had reached 9. The county medical examiner of Essex County, a young Newark physician named Dr. Harrison Martland, began his own quiet investigation. Martland was 39 years old, the son of a Civil War veteran, a graduate of Columbia Medical School with a private fellowship at the Rockefeller Institute. He was meticulous. He was incorruptible. He was the kind of physician who got curious about an autopsy and then could not stop. He requested permission from the Maggia family to exhume Mollie's body 5 years after burial and run radioactivity tests on her bones. The Maggia family granted permission. When Martland placed Mollie's femur on a photographic plate in his Newark laboratory in October 1927, the bone exposed the plate from inside the wrapping paper. Without any external light source, the bone was radioactive. The bone was radioactive 5 years after burial. The bone would be radioactive in 2027, and in 3027, and in 7027. Martland published his findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association in December 1925, with 3 more women's bones reading the same way. The U.S. Radium Corporation issued a public denial. 2 years before Martland's exhumation, in the spring of 1924, the U.S. Radium Corporation had hired its own outside expert, Dr. Cecil Drinker, a physiologist at the Harvard School of Public Health, one of the most respected industrial medicine researchers in the United States. The company asked Drinker to examine the women in the Orange plant and to write a report. Drinker examined 25 active dial painters in May and June 1924. Every single one of them showed signs of radium poisoning, bone damage, blood abnormalities, anemias, jaw infections. Drinker wrote up his findings in June 1924 and submitted his report to Arthur Roeder. The report was uncompromising. It stated that the paint was killing the workers, that the lip-dip paint technique was the direct cause, and that the company must end the practice immediately and provide medical care for every woman who had ever worked there. What Arthur Roeder did with that report in the summer of 1924 became one of the foundational documents in the modern history of corporate fraud. Roeder did not publish Drinker's report. Roeder did not give it to the painters. Roeder did not give it to public health authorities. Roeder rewrote it. He had a company employee, a chemist named Frederick Flynn, no relation to Sabin von Sochaki's New York doctor, produce a new document dated 1924, attributed to Cecil Drinker as the author, but bearing none of Drinker's actual conclusions. The rewritten document said that the workers were perfectly healthy. Roeder then submitted that document, under Drinker's name, to the New Jersey Department of Labor. The Department of Labor, satisfied that an outside Harvard expert had cleared the company, closed its inquiry into the deaths in Orange in 1925. The lip-dip paint technique continued. More women began to die. Cecil Drinker himself did not learn what had been done with his name until 1927, when he was contacted by a young woman named Catherine Wiley, a labor activist with the New Jersey Consumers League. Wiley had been quietly investigating the dial painter deaths for 2 years on her own, with no funding and no institutional support. She had located Drinker through a Harvard mailing list and asked him whether his report had really cleared the company. Drinker was furious. He published his original 1924 report in full in the Journal of Industrial Hygiene in August 1928. By the time it appeared in print, 4 more women in Orange were dead and another 9 were dying. Grace Fryer began having trouble with her teeth in the autumn of 1923. She was 22 by then, no longer a dial painter. She had left U.S. Radium in 1920 and become a teller at the Fidelity Union Trust Company in Newark, exactly as she had planned. She wore stockings and a wool coat to work, walked to the office every morning down Hawthorne Avenue, and was, by the standards of any young woman in northern New Jersey in 1923, perfectly successful. Until her teeth began to fall out. First a molar, then an incisor on the left side on a Tuesday afternoon at the bank while she was counting bills at the teller's window. The tooth simply came out into her hand. She closed her hand around it and went into the lavatory and cried. By 1925, Grace had been to 7 dentists and 4 physicians. None of them could explain. One in Philadelphia told her she had pyorrhea. One in New York told her she had vitamin deficiency. A general practitioner in Newark told her she had, like Mollie Maggia, syphilis. Grace had never been with a man. She told the doctor she had never been with a man. The doctor wrote down syphilis anyway. By 1926, her hip bones were beginning to fracture under her own weight. She walked with a cane. She was 25 years old. In 1927, Grace Fryer met Dr. Harrison Martland, the Newark medical examiner who had exhumed Mollie Maggia. Martland tested Grace and confirmed she was dying of radium poisoning. The radium had moved through her bloodstream into her bones. She had perhaps 2 years left. She had perhaps 5. No one knew. Martland gave her his diagnosis on a Thursday afternoon in August 1927 in his Newark office. Grace did not weep. She asked him whom she should sue. Finding a lawyer was harder than Grace had expected. 6 attorneys in Newark and New York refused her case. The statute of limitations on workplace injury claims in New Jersey was 2 years. Grace had left U.S. Radium 7 years earlier. Every lawyer told her the same thing. The case was over before it started. The courts would never hear it. The company's lawyers were among the best in New York, and a sick young woman of 26 with no money was not, frankly, going to win. The 7th attorney was a young man named Raymond Berry. He was 33 years old. He had been in private practice in Newark for 2 years. He had no industrial injury experience. He took her case for a percentage of any award. He told her she would have to find other dial painters, also dying, willing to be plaintiffs alongside her. Grace found 4. Edna Hussman, 24, paralyzed from the waist down in Bloomfield. Quinta McDonald, 28, hip bones disintegrating, also Mollie Maggia's older sister. Albina Larice, 26, jaw destroyed, Mollie's other older sister. Catherine Schaub, 24, with anemia so severe she could no longer leave her bed. The 5 women, they were called by the New York newspapers, beginning in February 1928, the Radium Girls, filed suit against the United States Radium Corporation in Essex County Superior Court on May 18, 1927. They asked for $250,000 each. Together, including Grace, the 5 could collectively walk only with assistance and could collectively raise their arms barely to shoulder level. They sat in court on the day the suit was filed. Grace, the strongest, sat with her cane between her knees. Edna had to be carried into the courtroom by her father. The Radium Corporation's lawyers, a Wall Street firm, Lindebury, Depew, and Fawkes, retained at considerable expense, moved immediately for a delay. The first scheduled trial date in September 1927 was postponed at the company's request because, the company said, its expert witnesses were unavailable. The new date in January 1928 was postponed again because, the company said, additional discovery was needed. By the third postponement in April 1928, Grace was beginning to understand what the strategy was. The company was waiting for them to die. The 5 plaintiffs, between them, had been given an estimated 4 years of remaining life by Dr. Martland. If the company could delay the trial past that mark, every plaintiff would be dead and the case would die with them. In April 1928, Grace Fryer gave a press conference from her bed in her parents' house in Newark, the bed she could no longer leave for more than an hour at a time. She told the New York World newspaper that the company was waiting for her to die. She told the New York Times the same thing the next morning. She told the Newark Evening News, 3 days later, that she would give every interview the company tried to silence, and that if she had to be carried into the courthouse on a stretcher, she would be carried. The press took her side. Walter Lippmann, the country's most influential newspaper columnist, wrote in the New York World on May 10, 1928. The column reproduced in 73 other American papers within 48 hours that the case of the Radium Girls was a moral test of American capitalism. The U.S. Radium Corporation's stock dropped 14 points in a week. The company's largest contract, with the Bulova Watch Company, was suspended. On June 4, 1928, 3 weeks before the scheduled trial, the company offered to settle. Each woman received $10,000 in cash. Each woman received $600 per year for the rest of her life, a pension. All future medical and dental expenses related to radium poisoning would be paid by the company. Grace, the leader, signed first. Quinta and Albina, the Maggia sisters, signed second. Edna Hussman, who could not hold a pen, made her mark with her father guiding her hand. Catherine Schaub signed last. The company admitted no wrongdoing. The company stated in the settlement papers that the payment was made in good faith and without prejudice. The 5 plaintiffs taken together lived an average of 3 more years after the settlement. Edna Hussman died first in 1930. Albina Larice followed in 1930. Catherine Schaub in 1933. Quinta MacDonald in 1929. Grace Fryer, the leader, the bank teller, the engaged young woman with ambition, died on October 27, 1933. She was 34 years old. Her fiancé, Lieutenant Charles Sawyer, never married. In Ottawa, Illinois, the Radium Dial Company watched the New Jersey settlement, calculated its costs, and decided to do nothing. The Ottawa plant did not change its procedures. The Ottawa plant did not warn its painters. The Ottawa plant did not establish a medical fund. When the New Jersey settlement was reported in the Chicago Tribune in June 1928, the Radium Dial Company superintendent in Ottawa, a man named Rufus Reed, gathered the painters in the studio and assured them that the New Jersey troubles had nothing to do with them. The Illinois product, Reed said, was different. The Illinois technique was safer. The Illinois painters had nothing to fear. Catherine Wolfe, by then Catherine Wolfe Donohue, she had married Tom Donohue, a Polish-American factory worker at the local Eagle Pitcher zinc plant in 1925, sat in the front row and listened to Rufus Reed and went back to work that afternoon. She was 25 years old. She had 2 children, Tommy and Mary Jane. She was making 50 cents per 100 dials, and the family needed the money for a new roof. Catherine kept painting until 1931. By that point, her teeth had begun to fall out. First the molars, then the incisors. She left the plant in March 1931, when she could no longer raise her right arm to hold the brush above her shoulder. The plant's doctor, who examined her on her last day, told her that she was suffering from rheumatism caused by sitting in cold drafts. He gave her a bottle of cod liver oil, He charged her $1. The Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois, continued operating until 1936. Between 1922 and 1936, the plant employed approximately 1,000 women. By 1936, 14 of them were already dead from confirmed radium poisoning, and at least 60 more were dying, including Catherine Donohue. Including Catherine's best friend Charlotte Purcell, whose left arm had been amputated in 1934 after the bone in her humerus simply collapsed. Including Catherine's neighbor Pearl Payne. Including Catherine's co-worker Marie Becker, who at 38 had the bone density of a woman of 85. The Illinois women had a problem the New Jersey women had not had. Illinois had no statute equivalent to New Jersey's workmen's compensation reform. Illinois law in the 1930s required, for any occupational disease claim, that the worker file within 1 year of the last day of employment. Catherine had quit the plant in March 1931. By the time Charlotte Purcell's amputation in 1934 made the connection unmistakable, Catherine's window to file had closed 3 years earlier. Every Illinois lawyer Catherine consulted between 1934 and 1937 told her the same thing every New Jersey lawyer had told Grace Fryer in 1925. The case was over before it started. The lawyer who finally took Catherine's case was named Leonard Grossman. He was a Chicago labor attorney, 41 years old, the son of Russian Jewish immigrants. He had spent the previous decade representing meatpacking workers, miners, garment workers, almost always for free. Grossman drove the 75 miles from Chicago to Ottawa in February 1937 to meet Catherine in person. She received him on the front porch of her small frame house on East Superior Street, in a wicker chair her husband had carried out for her, because she could no longer climb the steps to her own front door. Grossman would later say, in a 1942 oral history recording at the University of Chicago, that he saw Catherine that afternoon in the chair, weighing perhaps 80 pounds, holding her son Tommy on what was left of her lap, and that he understood at that moment that he was either going to find a way to win her case or he was going to die trying. He found the way. Ottawa, Illinois, 1903 to 1938. Grossman filed Catherine's case not in civil court, where the statute of limitations had expired, but with the Illinois Industrial Commission, the state-level body that adjudicated workmen's compensation claims. He filed in February 1938 on the legal theory that radium poisoning was a continuing injury, that the bone destruction was happening daily as new alpha particles fired into Catherine's living tissue, and that therefore each day of damage constituted a new occupational injury, starting the statute of limitations clock fresh. It was an unprecedented argument. No American court had ever accepted the doctrine of continuing injury for an occupational disease. The Industrial Commission scheduled a hearing for April 1938. By then, Catherine Donohue weighed 71 pounds. She could not walk. She could not stand. She could not eat solid food. The commission agreed to hold the hearing on the front porch of her house in Ottawa, with Catherine in her wicker chair, with the company's lawyer seated on folding chairs in her front yard. The hearing on April 25, 1938 lasted 6 hours. Catherine testified for 2 of those hours. She held a small handheld microphone connected to a stenographer's recording machine. The very first time, according to Illinois state records, that an Industrial Commission hearing had been recorded on audio. The recording survives. It can be heard today in the Smithsonian collection. Catherine's voice on the recording is thin, weak, sometimes interrupted by coughing. She does not cry. She gives the timeline of her employment. She describes the lip dip paint technique. She describes Rufus Reed's June 1928 speech to the painters. She describes the company doctor in 1931, telling her she had rheumatism. At one point, her voice breaks slightly, and she says, and this exact phrase has been quoted in every Illinois labor textbook published since 1942. I would not be here today in this condition if they had told us. They knew. They knew and they did not tell us. That is what they did. They knew. They knew and they did not tell us. The Illinois Industrial Commission ruled in Catherine Donohue's favor on July 6, 1938. The award was $5,661.86, the maximum allowable under Illinois Workmen's Compensation Statute. The Radium Dial Company immediately appealed to the Illinois Industrial Commission's full panel. The full panel upheld the award. The company appealed to the Illinois Circuit Court. The Circuit Court upheld the award. The company appealed to the Illinois Appellate Court. The Appellate Court upheld the award. The company appealed to the Illinois Supreme Court. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld the award. The company appealed to the Supreme Court of the United States. 8 appeals in 19 months. The strategy was the same one U.S. Radium had used against the New Jersey women a decade earlier. Wait for the plaintiff to die. Catherine Donohue did not last that long. She died on July 27, 1938, 21 days after the Industrial Commission's first ruling in the middle of the company's first appeal. She was 35 years old. She had given her final testimony from her bed 3 days before her death, propped up on pillows by her husband Tom, with her 2 children in the next room. She was buried at St. Columba Cemetery in Ottawa on July 30, 1938, in a Catholic Mass attended by approximately 200 people. Her gravestone reads simply, Catherine Wolfe Donohue, 1903 to 1938, beloved wife and mother. The stone does not say that she had won. The U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear the Radium Dial Company's appeal on October 23, 1939. The Illinois Industrial Commission's award stood. Tom Donohue received the $5,661.86. He used the money to bury Catherine and to feed Tommy and Mary Jane through the next 4 years. Catherine Donohue's case became, almost immediately, the foundational American precedent for occupational disease law. Every state that subsequently enacted occupational disease coverage in workmen's compensation cited the Donohue ruling. The first edition of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration Handbook, published in 1971, 33 years after Catherine's death, opened its first chapter with the words, "The dial painters of New Jersey and Illinois established the modern doctrine of employer responsibility for workplace disease." Her name was not mentioned, but she was the woman the sentence was about. In the years following Catherine Donohue's death, the United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey continued to operate. The Radium Dial Company in Ottawa, Illinois continued to operate. Both companies pivoted in the 1940s to wartime production for the U.S. military. The very same dial painting work, but performed in lead-shielded enclosures with mechanical brushes, with daily medical screening, and with absolute prohibitions on the lip-dip paint technique that had killed the original painters. The companies, in other words, knew exactly how to do the work safely. They had simply chosen, for 20 years, not to. The Radium Dial Company was renamed Luminous Processes Incorporated in 1942 and continued painting dials in Ottawa, Illinois until 1978. When Luminous Processes finally closed, the Environmental Protection Agency declared the Ottawa plant site a Superfund toxic waste cleanup zone. The cleanup, which began in 1985, removed an estimated 900,000 cubic feet of radioactive soil. It cost the federal taxpayers approximately $140 million. The company, by then long bankrupt, paid nothing toward the cleanup. No executive of the original Radium Dial Company, of Luminous Processes, or of U.S. Radium Corporation in New Jersey was ever charged with any crime. No executive ever served a single day in jail. Arthur Roeder, the U.S. Radium president who had buried Cecil Drinker's report in 1924, retired with a full pension and died of natural causes in 1940 in his Montclair home. He was 65. No executive of any radium company was ever charged with any crime. What the dial painters had done, beyond dying for their employers' profits, was to create the medical and legal framework that made every modern American workplace safety law possible. Their bones, exhumed for research between 1925 and 1980, gave physicians the first detailed understanding of how internally deposited radiation kills human beings. The data from those exhumations was used during the Manhattan Project to set the original safety standards for plutonium workers. The same data was used by NASA in 1962 to design radiation shielding for the Apollo astronauts. The same data is used today to set every limit on every radiation worker in every nuclear plant, every hospital radiology department, every dental X-ray operator in the United States. Every American who has ever had a routine medical X-ray was protected by the death of women they have never heard of. Their case, Donohue versus Radium Dial, 1939, established the doctrine of continuing injury, the legal foundation for every subsequent corporate liability claim involving slow-developing occupational disease. Without Donohue, the asbestos litigation of the 1970s would not have been possible. Without Donohue, the silicosis claims of coal miners would not have been possible. Without Donohue, the lawsuits brought by Vietnam veterans exposed to Agent Orange would not have been possible. Without Donohue, the lawsuits brought by 9/11 first responders for cancers caused by ground zero dust, every one of those cases relied on legal precedent established by a 35-year-old woman testifying from a wicker chair on her front porch in Ottawa, Illinois, in April 1938. In August 2022, 84 years after Catherine Donohue's death, President Joseph Biden signed the Lejeune Justice Act into law. The act allowed nearly 1 million United States Marine Corps veterans, their families, and the civilian workers who had lived on the Camp Lejeune base in Jacksonville, North Carolina, between 1953 and 1987, to sue the federal government for damages caused by toxic chemicals in the base's drinking water. The Marine Corps had known the water was contaminated since 1981. Internal Navy memos confirmed it. The Marine Corps did nothing. For 33 years, Marine families drank, bathed in, and cooked with water containing trichloroethylene, perchloroethylene, vinyl chloride, and benzene, at concentrations up to 240 times the modern federal safe limit. Approximately 1 million people were exposed. The cancer rates among them are several multiples of the national average. The Department of the Navy's response, when investigators began asking questions in the 1990s and 2000s, was first to deny that any contamination had occurred, and then, when contamination was admitted, to claim that no one could prove that the contamination had caused any specific case of cancer. The legal doctrine that allowed the Camp Lejeune families to sue, 8 decades after the original injury, the doctrine that the running of the statute of limitations does not begin until the victim could reasonably have known of the harm, is a direct descendant of Donohue versus Radium Dial. The pattern is the same. The pattern is always the same. An employer or a government body knows that what it is doing will hurt the workers under its protection. It chooses not to tell them. It chooses to manufacture documents that say the opposite of what its own scientists have found. It hires its own physicians to attribute the deaths to other causes. When the workers begin to die, it stalls them in court. When their families finally win, it pays a fraction of the actual cost, admits no wrongdoing, and continues operating. The names change. Radium becomes asbestos. Asbestos becomes silica. Silica becomes Agent Orange. Agent Orange becomes burn pit smoke in Iraq and Afghanistan. Burn pit smoke becomes PFAS in firefighter foam. The names change, the pattern does not. In 2008, a team of researchers from Argonne National Laboratory and Northwestern University conducted radiometric surveys of 17 graves in St. Columba Cemetery in Ottawa, Illinois. Catherine Donohue Cemetery. 12 of the 17 graves registered radioactivity levels significantly above background. Catherine Donohue's grave registered a reading of approximately 200 counts per minute on a Geiger-Mueller detector held 1 foot above the soil. Background in that part of Illinois is roughly 20 counts per minute. The bones in Catherine's coffin, 86 years after her death, are still 10 times more radioactive than the surrounding earth. St. Mary's Cemetery in Orange, New Jersey, where Mollie Maggia and Grace Fryer and Edna Hussman and Quinta MacDonald and Albina Larice and Catherine Schaub are buried, has, in 2008, 23 graves with similar elevated readings. A human pelvis found in radium painter remains, exhumed for research at Argonne in the 1970s, was, when measured in 2003, still emitting alpha particles at a rate sufficient to expose photographic film over 24 hours of contact. The bone will continue to emit at that rate for another 1,600 years. In Ottawa, Illinois, on the corner of Fulton Street and Clinton Street, where the Radium Dial factory once stood, there is now a small bronze statue. It depicts a young woman in a 1920s shift dress, holding a paintbrush in one hand and a tulip in the other. The statue was dedicated in 2011, 73 years after Catherine Donohue's death. It was paid for entirely by private donations from the residents of Ottawa, none of whom were members of the families of the original painters. The brass plate on the base of the statue reads simply, "The Radium Girls, they gave everything." Catherine Donohue's son Tommy died in 2014 at the age of 84 in a nursing home in Ottawa. He had spent his life as a tool and die maker at the Caterpillar plant in Joliet. In an oral history recorded in 2007 with the Illinois Labor History Society, Tommy Donohue described the night his mother died. She had asked him to come to her bed 3 days before the end. She was 8 years old. She held his hand for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "Tommy, listen. Make sure they remember what they did. Not just to me, to all the girls who glowed." She did not say, "Do not let them forget me." She said, "Do not let them forget what they did." Not the victim. The accusation. Make sure they remember what they did, not just to me, to all the girls who glowed. Today, in 2026, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration is approximately 56 years old. It is, by any measure, the most under-resourced major regulatory agency in the United States federal government. Its enforcement budget, adjusted for inflation, is smaller in 2026 than it was in 1980. The number of OSHA inspectors per American worker is the lowest it has been since the agency's founding. At current staffing, an average American workplace will receive an OSHA inspection roughly once every 176 years. In 2024, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics estimated that approximately 120,000 American workers die each year from occupational exposure to toxic substances, chemicals their employers know are toxic. Most of those deaths are slow. Most of those deaths are cataloged by the families and the doctors involved as something other than what they were: cancers of unknown origin, heart disease, premature aging. The pattern Catherine Donohue testified to from her wicker chair in 1938 is operating today in 200,000 American workplaces. The names have changed. The pattern has not. The bones still glow. They will glow for 1,600 years. Long after every man, woman, and child alive in America today is dust, the bones of the Radium Girls will still be glowing in their graves in St. Columba Cemetery and St. Mary's Cemetery and Holy Sepulchre Cemetery in East Orange, New Jersey. They will be glowing on the day the United States ceases to exist as a nation. They will be glowing on the day the English language is no longer spoken. They will be glowing on the day every textbook of American labor history is dust. 1,000 years from now, an archaeologist with a Geiger counter walking across a small Illinois cemetery surrounded by what used to be cornfields will find Catherine Donohue's bones still emitting alpha particles into the soil. The archaeologist will not know what radium was, what the United States was, what an industrial corporation was, or what a 35-year-old Irish-American woman in a wicker chair on her front porch had been trying to tell the world. But the radioactivity will still be there. Memory in the bone. Accusation in the bone. The girls who glowed. I am Leonard. This is DarkCon. They were 14 years old and they glowed in the dark, and the company knew, and the company watched them die, and no one ever went to jail. Catherine Donohue's last words to her son were, "Make sure they remember what they did." Not to her, to all the girls who glowed. They survived so you wouldn't forget. Subscribe.